Welcome to the Give It Up podcast on urbanmediatoday.com. My guests are back from last week. None other than my classmate, Parker Weaver, and my other classmate at Prescott College, Jen Heeter. Welcome back. How are you guys doing today?
Good. It's been a long week.
The
Thank you.
The week goes so fast.
It's my first week teaching in person, so
Boom.
It's been an adventure.
Oh, that's awesome. Good for you. Okay, so last week we talked about before the verdict, everything leading up to the Derek Chauvin verdict. We talked a little bit about George Floyd and his death, and we talked about how we've had conversations with our families about race and how you guys have pretty much tried to implement an anti-racist curriculum within your various school districts, and you guys are coming live from California, Oakland. And what part of California you in, Parker?
Paso Robles. It's just the Central Coast.
Paso Robles, something that I think I pronounced okay. I did pretty good on that. Central Coast. All right. So my first question for you is this. What was your initial reaction to the verdict when they said guilty, guilty, guilty? Was that something you expected, guilty on all three charges? Or did you expect like lesser charges? What did you think when that verdict came down?
I actually so I have Associated Press on my phone where they give you live updates for me and my students. So when things happen, we can like talk about it as soon as it happens. So I actually have this screenshot. I actually screenshotted it on my phone of when it happened. I have this thing, and maybe it's part of anxiety, maybe it's just the way that I think, but I have to I was both relieved and shocked, but also like I knew that would be the verdict just because of the way the conversation in the country has gone, but I didn't quite believe it for me personally. Like it took me a while. So like I read multiple articles. I watched a video of the Justice for George group watching the verdict, like seeing their reactions. And then finally that settled in for me that it had actually happened because it didn't quite seem real. And then obviously it went from surprise to relief and then to, okay, but what's next? Like I didn't let myself feel that victory for very long because I can't as an educator, because it was justice in a certain perspective for certain people, but I don't know how his family feels. I don't know how the community feels, and I couldn't assume that it was justice for them. But there is that joy that it was a guilty verdict, but I need to figure out, like I said in the first podcast, what that looks like and how I would teach it, and whether or not that conversation is a safe space to do that in my classroom. But then obviously then you have the Ma'Khia Bryant shooting right afterwards within minutes, and then the conversation complicated. And I went from how do I talk about George Floyd and Derek Chauvin and this to, okay, it's a bigger conversation. Now we have to go bigger quick.
Yeah, you're right. Jen, what about you? What was your reaction? What did you think?
Yeah, so I was also at school that day. We had kids come on campus in small groups, and so it was the verdict came through in California right when we were transitioning groups, and a few of us were walking around just kind of waiting. I was less positive because I feel like we've lived this hope for change for so long and keep getting let down when it comes to policing, when it comes to justice, when it comes to government. I cannot for the life of me understand how Trump got elected last time. So I just feel like I didn't have as much hope, but we all got
That's been a topic, by the way, on this podcast several times.
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable. Mm-hmm. Wow. But we got the notification and took a few minutes to celebrate, and then started talking through, okay, that's not justice. There's accountability for once. And so that's massive. And what's next? And then to also hear very quickly thereafter about Ma'Khia was devastating. Some of the conversations that were happening on Instagram were, going into George's family perspective, and what we can hold and what we can celebrate and what we can support, and then where does it take it from here, or where does this take us? Will this be a repeating pattern, or was that just because George Floyd's case got made visible to such a high degree?
So that leads me into some of our educational theories that we've been discussing in our social justice program at Prescott. So, in the Cabral sense, if I'm pronouncing his name right, uh, do you think there is a political change in what will go forward? Will the politics of this change? And if we talk about another, I can throw another name out here. Is it enough of a Gramsci crisis that things can shift politically? Has the terrain changed as a result of George Floyd's death? If you recall, his daughter said after his death that he was going to change the world. Like, do you think this was that thing?
I think it could be. I'm doing the readings for this week, and it's talking about how when there's a crisis, there's a vacuum where something is missing and someone can take the space. And I feel like with George Floyd, it created a vacuum of change. It's who can actually take that space. And I'm a little bit worried for what that space taking will look like, because you have the Justice and Policing Act, but then you've got two other representatives who are going with a different perspective with the Breathe Act that requires even more accountability. And then who are we actually allowing it? Does it become a non-reformist reforms, or are we just allowing liberal reformers to say that the Justice and Policing Act will do something and then say, haha, we did it, and then not have accountability for that? So you're making another act, but who's going to be accountable that those things go into place? So it does allow for change. It's just really worrisome thinking about who's actually going to take up that space and make those political changes and who has the voice. And for me, I'm more pro the Breathe Act because I trust those representatives more, and they've been much more transparent about their expectations for communities, and it's a lot more community focused rather than law enforcement. The Policing Act is still very heavily law enforcement and not really focused on communities and healing and what that would look like, and restorative justice and like alternate abolitionist approaches.
That was actually my next question. So is that George Floyd Justice and Policing Act more reformist reforms than it is non-reformist reforms? And like you said, I know there's certain things in there that I think the bail, like if you could eliminate bail, because I had looked up a statistic the other day. I think it said 550,000 people were in prisons that were never sentenced or convicted because they because they couldn't afford bail. So
one of my kids,
I'm like, maybe that is a non-reformist reform because it can have widespread change. So I don't know.
I think sprinkled in as these non-reformist reforms, but it's structured in such like a neoliberalist like format that it's really worrisome of who's the accountable. I think those ideas are brilliant. I just don't know who's accountable to make sure that they happen, because like you're saying with bail, that would be awesome. One of my kids' aunts has been in prison for 7 years because of bail and because of the way the trial process, and she hasn't even gone through trial. For 7 years, he hasn't seen his aunt, and he's 16.
Her, and it's a female. Wow.
Yes. So on top of this, so like the readings that we're doing this week, it just reminds me of Biden's Violence Against Women Act, that like on top, it was like, look at all the things we're doing, but then never actually meets the needs of the individual woman in this space. It's like law. Okay, but this has already happened. So what do we do with the people who've already experienced institutional racism? And how do we help and heal them? It can't all be preventative. There has to be resources. And I think that law is mainly preventative with quotation marks and a lot less what happens after and the people who are currently actually hurting.
Something that's
And what
sustainable within the community that prevents you from going to prison in the first place.
exactly. So community building versus legal building.
Right.
At
Jump
least
in,
that's
Jen.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with it. I mean, I definitely think the terrain has changed. I think the visibility, the accountability, people are alert and they're watching now and they're recording. And so I think that level of, so that's where I think the summers, the digital mobilizing that we could do that kind of exploded over the summer made folks on alert. And are able to share messages, share stories with light speed and very far reaching. So I think folks are alert, and that fed into what happened with the Derek Chauvin verdict. Now, in regard to actually putting things in place so that this pattern or accountability remains, for folks who take action like that, I don't know if that will be the case. I certainly hope it will. And again, for folks who are amplifying injustice and then really communicating in a broad way how individuals can take action to bring voice or to bring attention to a matter, as long as that keeps this level of fervor, I think that will be helpful. I think a lot about abolition as presence now after Ruthie Wilson Gilmore. And so I do think that, our system is broken. Or not broken. I think it's set up, it's working exactly how it was set to be. And so in order to truly make the change that we're hoping to see, something needs to happen to that system. And so that's where I see these wraparound pieces that support mental health, that support the gaps in community that are propelling folks into crime or into situations where they become part of the carceral state, become part of the criminal justice system. And then, because once you're in, there's really, it takes a lot to get out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So focusing on the
My
building.
next question. So I guess maybe Parker could answer it. Miriam Kaba, we learned from her exactly what you just said about the prison industrial complex, as well as, policing in America. The systems are not broke. If we go back to the origins of policing that came out of, slave catching, and, the prison industrial complex, it's to me, it's more about profit than it is about people. It's about keeping a certain class of people subordinate, and the other group of people being able to profit off of that and get to maintain their supremacy and their status. So like you said, and like Kaba said, and like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says, the system is not broke. It's working exactly the way it's meant to work. And with that being said, if something is working the way it's meant to be working, how can we get something like you said, the Breathe Act or the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed? How do those things get passed when you have members of Congress that are so adamant to keep those systems in place? And this is my example where I think that this is worrisome to me. If you guys just heard that they just passed the anti-Asian hate crime bill, and only one Republican senator voted against it because he said it was too broad. It was 94-1. What that says to me, because anything else that has to do with Black people, I'm just going to call it the way I see it, it's split right down the middle. The Democrats are going to vote yes, and the Republicans are voting no. So for some reason, the Republicans are not threatened by Asian Americans. That's what it means to me. I don't know what that means to you, but if it's 94-1, they almost had 100% of the people, what they call bipartisan, which is another, term we could talk about a little bit later, where bipartisan means probably that justice loses. But yeah, to me, that was just weird. If almost you had 100% of people vote for an anti-Asian hate crimes bill, but you're not going to vote for something that that helps Black people. I just have a problem with that. Something about it is a little bit strange. I don't know if you guys saw that.
I don't know entirely, but it's such an interesting conversation. I'm in complete agreement with you. It's also the false narrative of the model minority. It's a minority that isn't going to limit white supremacy. I feel like it was a whole argument of white supremacy still rules. We're going to give you this one so that we look better and look more supreme. Like that was where I saw it leading is,
Oh, wow.
Look at how far we've come without any responsibility or accountability for it. So it's an anti-hate crime bill saying, oh, good, look how far we've come. Stop looking at the stuff that we haven't done. For me, it was like a distraction technique to say, okay, so that's become in the media within the last 2-3 months, right? Even though it's been since the beginning of the pandemic.
Yes.
But we've had over 400 years of new Jim Crow laws and the way that we've treated Black people in this country. And there hasn't been a single bill that actually unilaterally provides real accountability and access and help. The Civil Rights Bill on the surface said, hey, you're equal, but we're not going to do anything about it. We're going to say it and then provide a separate bipartisan organization that overlooks it to see if your rights are there, but then don't provide accountability. So when we're talking about the system working, when they allow the system to work together, it's because they all benefit. It is a capitalistic idea. I even had an argument with my dad about why our country gets into wars and treats people terribly. And he was singularly the capitalist thought. But like you said, it's intersectional. It's both an ideological superiority and a capitalist superiority, thinking that we have a right to treat people a certain way because we believe we're better. So for me, the anti-Asian hate crime was, don't worry, we're better. We know better, but we're not going to really do anything about it. Wow. So then when we have this new one with the Policing Act and it's split, it's like, okay, well, now the accountability is gone. Now the like clear lines of what it means to treat people with kindness and respect and honor is gone. Where are you losing? And then we're starting to see the capitalist argument. It is foundationally would limit their power. And I'm like, okay, well, welcome back to the fact that the country is working to push patriarchal white power and try to pretend it's not and be like, look, we're doing good. I'm like, but you're trying to frame it like you're doing good so that people don't look at other things that you sneak into bills that we don't see because they're like miles long that they try to push through really quick. So it was very
love it.
Yeah, my friends or my peer group prefer to use the term white inferiority because they're just in light of that threat. There is anti-Black sentiment within Congress, within the government, within policing, within our judicial system, and so the just the threat of the security, the dominance, the power, the financial resources, it's hard and fast within our systems. So yeah, still systems are still doing what they were designed to do.
And what does give me hope though is like with my students and with education, they're willing to still learn about it. As many bad things as I'm sharing with them and want to be transparent about the way that their world works. Yesterday, I asked them if they wanted to know more about Bryant's case and what happened, and if they wanted to talk more about Derek Chauvin because it's been so heavy. I'm like, do you have the space in your life right now to talk about it? And unanimously, every class said yes. They wanted to have more conversations. They wanted to be in the loop. And for me, that shows sympathy, that shows empathy, where we're seeing such apathy from a lot of the places in the world for my students at 16 and 17 to be holding the pandemic on their shoulders and still wanting to know and knowing and wanting to feel despite it all is just remarkable, despite how some students are like, well, what do we do now? and I get to talk about this program. I'm like, well, this is what I'm doing now. And that's been awesome to let them be part of it, to see that I've also had a hard time with things and there are next steps. It's just not easy ones. And that does give me hope, is their willingness to like still be a part of the conversation no matter how difficult it is.
I love what you're saying because my long held belief is that if we don't talk about race, how are we going to ever change, this country? Like how, if we don't at least be able to have the conversations, and those conversations start with children. So I've been pushing, at least in my school district, for my entire career, to not just have a conversation like within my class about race, but I want to have a town hall with parents, with students, with all community members, with teachers, staff members, administrators, where we bring in people that are actually experts in a thing, and you're not just giving your opinion about stuff that you really can't even relate to. That I say this almost weekly on the podcast. If you haven't experienced a thing, maybe you should keep your mouth shut and listen to people that have. So if you've never been profiled by the police, right? If you've never had a family member murdered by the police, if you've never been in any situation that involves race, that involves discrimination, then you should probably listen to those people that have, and then form your opinion based on that. And I think you're right. I think kids are hungry for these conversations. I think they want the country to move forward in a just way. And I think adults are standing in the way of that. At
Yes.
least in my situation, I feel like adults are standing in the way of that. So go ahead, Jen, jump in there.
Oh, I'm just agreeing with you. Absolutely. And it's really hard for adults to not take up space, to stop talking and ask, is my voice necessary here? Is this, am I contributing? Just listening and learning, so that you truly are building empathy and understanding that if you don't have that lived experience, then there's just a huge piece that you're missing. I also see that with the, coming out of this world pandemic, the kids are going to be fine. They're going to bounce back. They're resilient.
Yeah.
We're going to give them the tools that they need to deal. But if the adults in the space are projecting trauma, they're going to respond to that, and they're going to have bigger issues with mental health and support and need as they grow out of it. So it's all about the kids. But the
That, that's
stop.
a good point. That's
Well,
a
I
great
appreciate
point.
that you teach your teachers about that, because I'm in a district that avoids talking about those topics that they say that they're supporting, but then really aren't. And we had someone who's training to be an administrator do like a little quick survey on racial disparity on our campus and Latinx students who don't receive, like why there's such a gap for them. And teachers anonymously were supposed to put why they think there's an achievement gap. And then that was it. Our principal didn't go any further, and the answers appalled me
Oh,
and
God.
made me really worried that these aren't conversations that administrators are having with teachers, who are then the next step to students. So I feel like revamping professional development is kind of part of my goal as well, for what that looks like for teachers and how they advocate and what their language says to students, because they can think something personally, but their personal ideas should not influence or hurt or harm students. And we're not in that place yet. And until educators can learn how to actually be good educators, it's kind of a worrisome place right now in our education system, where I have fellow teachers anonymously saying that it is a cultural gap for the reason why students are not doing well, or parents don't really value education. And we're thinking about this in a lot of ignorant places within different developments, where people are just not knowledgeable, like we're saying, and aren't listening, and are coming up with false narratives that they're sharing based on stereotypes. And then they're continuing those stereotypes and teaching those stereotypes to other people within their workplace. The education system is the worst, because then you're teaching that stereotype to a child who then internalizes it and believes it about themselves. And then it becomes that manifest destiny of what you believe, then you become. And I think we're in a space as all educators where we have a different approach to that, but that should be in every job, that we learn how our language affects each other and listen when we don't actually have the knowledge about that. And that will become a skill, hopefully in time, that workplaces will figure out how to do. But there's a lot of, like you talked about intersectionality, like so many issues have to be solved before we can have administrators or CEOs or people who can then incorporate these ideas into systems, which is also a huge step for a lot of the things we're talking about as well.
Wow, you guys, you're killing it. Believe it or not, we only have a few minutes left again. This stuff goes quick, but before you go, I got 2 questions and you can answer them both at the same time if you want. We got about 4 or 5 minutes left. So my one question is, so what have you learned on your educational journey, like thus far, that you're going to take with you no matter where you go after this social justice program? Is there anything you've learned that you're like, you know what, this is something I have to carry with me everywhere I go, no matter where it takes me in my social justice journey? And then the other question is, if we have time to answer it, what does prison abolition or police abolition look like to you? Because I feel like our audience needs to know that as well. You can answer one or both of those questions. Go ahead, Jen.
So what I've learned in these, I don't know,
Looks
we're
like
in like
4
week,
months.
yeah. I don't know what it is. That I am an organizer. And so now it's, I entered into the program not thinking that I had any formal organizing skills, and realized that educators are organizing all the time. We're fundraising, we're getting buy-in from our families, we're building relationships with our families, we're getting students on the same page, and we're doing things in our school to propel our mission. So now that I have that understanding, that I'm really trying to develop this framework of strategies and tactics and understanding the process so I can grow my practice with that. So that's been awesome. And I found some, I'm learning theories and principles that I will certainly take with me, but I've really connected to some of these heroes that are leading these movements. Ruthie Wilson Gilmore is one, Mariam Kaba is another, that I just, it's kind of infused all the things that I seek out, in my free time, my like 30 minutes a day of free time.
Audience, look up those names. You will be happy if you do. Marian Kaba and Ruthie Wilson Gilmore. Look them up.
Yeah, so I'm taking them with me and continuing to learn about them.
I love it. Go ahead, Parker. You got about a minute left. Bring us home.
Okay. From this program, like you said, being an organizer, but I think the huge thing for me within the system is that Medina's class on radical practices pedagogy is that for people to really learn how to transform, they have to know themselves, they have to know their history, then they have to realize what their will to act actually is, what they want, and then they need to do it. And like that transformative process, I've literally taken into my classroom, into conversations with people, into what social justice can actually look like. Because if you don't know yourself and your history, how can you possibly decide to do it with your life? And you could be 40 and have no clue like who you truly are. And I think that comes from a pace of listening to and letting people discover that as a teacher, and really ask them those questions and engage in those relationships and let them find themselves, and let myself be a mediator for that. I'm really excited for. And that actually connects to my idea of abolition, is that it is so relationship based. Kaba hits so heavily on her teaching and creating space to learn how to do leadership and make mistakes, but also that the dream is for communities to care about each other. And when your neighbor has a problem, you help and you don't second guess it. That at the heart of things, it's really learning how to have better relationships with people, no matter the differences between you. If they're in your neighborhood, then they're your people, and really changing the dialogue of what that looks like. So my kids, they're my kids. I don't call them my students. They know that. They're my kids. They're my family. And I have to figure out how to develop good relationships with them and help them have good relationships with other people. And from there, that empathy will guide what social justice looks like for them.
I'm saying drop the mic on that. Right, Jen? You guys just dropped the mic. I am so blessed to have had you on my show. Once again, it's Parker and Jen. We're in this master's program at Prescott College, and it has been a blast for these last 2 episodes, getting to know you guys better and your thoughts just around social justice and what's going on in America. I am so very thankful. And anybody that was listening, you should listen to this twice because there's some gems in here. This has been the Give It Up podcast on urbanmediatoday.com. I'm giving it up for my guest, Parker Weaver and Jen Heeter. Shout outs to Kiki, Alan Lincoln, and Mr. and Trevin. Everybody give it up and be blessed.